Excellent. Thank you, Pyle. We are so happy to be partnering with Plug and Play on this program. And Pyle, we're so happy to have Plug and Play here in Houston. Your presence in the energy space here and the innovation ecosystem has not gone unnoticed, and we are just so excited to be working with you on this presentation and other programs as well. So, we will be jumping in here in just a second. As Pyle said, I am an IP attorney. I'm based here in the Houston office of Baker Botts. Cynthia is out in Palo Alto, and I'll let her introduce herself a little in just a minute once she gets into her slides. But I wanted to give a brief overview, excuse me, of what we will be covering today. As we all know, during this pandemic, with all of the COVID-19 data, data and protocols have been changing so frequently, almost on a daily basis at the beginning of the pandemic. Many companies have had to adapt really quickly to the changing environment and adapt quickly to a remote work environment and make sure that they are operating in the safest possible manner, not only with respect to the health and safety of their employees, but also with respect to the security and safety of the company's information. And so today we'll be covering several topics related to both remote work and reopening strategies as we sort of navigate this new normal that we're dealing with. Next slide, please, Cynthia. Perfect, thank you. So in the next 20 minutes or so, my colleague Cynthia and I will be going through and giving a high-level overview of some best practices to be thinking about with respect to privacy, security, and IP issues that you're probably dealing with in this remote work environment. We'll then shift gears a bit and talk about this new normal that we're dealing with and reopening in this during this pandemic. We'll discuss a few safety protocols for opening. Health declarations, thermal imaging, and contact tracing will be 3 protocols that we highlight here today and give a bit of overview on. We'll identify some recommendations and some best practices with respect to each of those protocols. So with that, I will turn it over to Cynthia to start us off on some of the remote working security requirements.
Thanks, Natalie. And just, I guess, a quick introduction about just myself and my background. So I'm located in the Bay Area, and I focus on data privacy and tech transactions. So I work with startups and mature companies, on sort of how generally data privacy compliance, but also how you interact with third parties with respect to data and IP also, right, which are obviously very important assets. And they're, the landscape with respect to those assets is changing very quickly. So, and I was in-house for about 13 years before I went back to private practice. So I was general counsel of a couple different startups. And so anyway, so now I'm back on the outside. So thanks, Natalie. So we'll kick this off. So yeah, remote working. I mean, this is something that, has been on the agenda, right, for a long time. And people have always talked about working from home, and now it's mandatory, right, in so many environments. And so many companies sort of dabbled in it, and they had policies and procedures around it, but the expectation was not that your entire workforce would be working remotely. And this just raises, in a very, very short period of time, some acute issues with respect to privacy, right? And like Natalie said, it's not just privacy of individuals, it's privacy of the company, trade secrets, and important assets of the company. And how are you protecting all of those assets, right? Employees included. So the laws did change very quickly, right, with respect to, I guess not with respect to security requirements. We'll get back to that later, but they changed very quickly with respect to collecting employee information, for example. But the issue largely is that the consumer data privacy laws that have been getting more and more intense for companies in the last couple of years have not changed. That agenda remains the same. And in fact, there is more activity with respect to lawsuits and different actions, and more activity on the federal level. I mean, there's a hearing tomorrow in DC on a federal proposal for the Safe Data Act. So again, it's these issues are only becoming more and more important, right? So companies need to deal with if you have international exposure, it's GDPR. If you're just in the US or both, it's the California Consumer Privacy Act, state breach notification laws. If you have a security incident, the Americans with Disabilities Act, FTC, and HIPAA, which HIPAA generally applies a lot less than people think it does. But these others fill in the gap, I would say, you know, in a pretty meaty way, right? So security requirements. Again, this is a question of, and I talked about it at the beginning, I mean, companies, frankly, this has been, I would say, companies have been lacking in a lot of ways with security best practices, and have looked at this as sort of remote working as optional. It's no longer optional, right? And so if it's no longer optional, you need to go back and you need to really take a hard look at your basic security hygiene, you know, with respect to encryption, with respect to policies and procedures, BYOD policies, right? Are employees using their own devices? And if they are, or any of the tools that companies are using, we saw this with respect to Zoom. A lot of the backlash that Zoom was getting at the beginning was that people could set their own privacy settings. And so maybe companies were under the impression that individuals were using Zoom in a certain way, and in fact, they were using it differently, right? So an example is, I just did a GoToWebinar demo with a client 2 days ago, and we did the demo, and we looked at all of the security issues with respect to the demo, and we looked at the admin sort of settings, and it raised a whole host. We expected to have a couple different issues, and it raised a whole host of others. And I think that taking the time to use the tools in the field, right, that you have chosen to roll out with your company and with your employees is extremely important, because it's only in doing those demos and in looking at all the issues that you will find possible leaks and possible problems. So, you know, I can't enforce that enough. I mean, I think, frankly, security is probably the biggest issue, right, facing companies right now. Natalie?
Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. And so many of these issues here that we'll be talking about next are sort of intertwined with what Cynthia is talking about with respect to security and what we need to be doing to make sure that we're protecting, you know, our biggest assets. And so here I have some best practices for protecting your IP, you know, trade secrets, obviously, your confidential information. So a couple of big takeaways here, and there's a lot on the slide, but a couple of the takeaways are, we need to make sure that you are clearly identifying your confidential information and your trade secret information, so that your employees and others outside of your company know that that information is confidential and trade secret. I have seen situations and cases where, you know, maybe the documents themselves didn't have the confidential designations that they should have had, and we definitely encourage you to mark documents as confidential if they are. But even if they are not marked appropriately, if you have done your job of making sure that your employees know that certain information is confidential company information, or certain information is a trade secret and only limited people have access to it, that can go a long way in litigation of making sure that you can establish that that information is a company trade secret. And there will be hurdles that you have to overcome to make sure that information is actually designated as a trade secret under the statute. So that's one thing. Second, you'll want to make sure that your employees are obviously bound by a confidentiality agreement or a policy that you have in place at your workplace. Many times employees are made to sign these agreements once they're onboarded. And so this shouldn't be an issue for your company, but if you are just starting out and you don't have this in place, this is something that you need to do as soon as possible. During this particular, remote work environment, you want to make sure that you're providing reminders to your employees and warnings about making sure that they're continuing to keep the company confidential information confidential. And so be sure to continue to do that as you go through. And sometimes when I know, for example, when I open my company computer, I'll get a notification. It's just a standard, standard language that notes that information is confidential and you're using your device for work purposes. And so this takes us to the personal device usage policies. And Cynthia sort of touched on this, the BYOD policy. And this is a policy that you'll have in place that talks about, authorized use of your device for company purposes, employee responsibilities, device security requirements, all of that. So if you don't have that in place, be sure that you're talking to somebody to get that, proper procedures in place and make that known to your employees. There are additional measures that you can take as well in order to protect your IP. And, there are check-in and check-out procedures. We have a document management systems where it will track when your employees are opening documents on the system and closing them out and saving them onto their personal hard drives or to cloud-based services. And so you'll want to look into some of those measures depending on the size of your company and the number of your employees, but know that those are out there and those are good measures to have, particularly in this current environment. Remote wiping and inspection capabilities are also very handy. Right now we're dealing also with not just the remote work environment.
Necessary. Sorry,
yeah.
Natalie, I would say necessary.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're also dealing with a lot of layoffs right now, right? I mean, there's a lot of downsizing, there's some consolidation going on. And so you'll have people who are going to have to leave, and you're going to have to deal with how to make sure that you are wiping their devices, wiping all of your confidential company information off of them. And so just things that you need to think about and that you need to be thinking about putting in place like ASAP. The last point that I'll note before we move on is training. And I talked about this earlier with respect to making sure that your employees know what is confidential and what is trade secret, but make sure that they know what policies are in place and that they know what their responsibilities are and what their requirements are to making sure that they are protecting what is quite possibly and most of the time one of the most important assets of the company, which is the IP. And so with that, let's move on to the next slide. Here are just some red flags that I wanted to include here, and I won't go through them in detail, but if you start to notice things happening, your employees, there's missing emails, there is evidence of some cloud-based remote storage services, large transfers of files from your network drive over to a USB drive or to a cloud-based service, then there might be something going on. And so these are red flags that you should keep an eye out for. And that goes back to, monitoring everything remotely and making sure that you're really keeping an eye on things, particularly in this remote work environment. Next slide. All right, so now we'll move on to reopening strategies. So, government industries all over the place are engaged in trying to make sure that they are doing what's best for their employees and for their company as they begin to reopen and navigate this new normal that we're dealing with. We'll go through and we'll talk about a few different initiatives that we're seeing and that some of our clients are putting in place, and those are health declarations. Of course, you'll see some, I think you'll hear from a startup later that is doing some work with QR codes. That's pretty typical. We're seeing a lot of that right now. Thermal screening, contract tracing, and there are a lot of federal, state, and local guidance and requirements and laws that are out there, and Cynthia will go through some of those as we start to talk about these different initiatives. So with that, Cynthia, do you want to go ahead and take it?
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So, I mean, just quickly, and I want to be mindful of time, but I think the biggest, I touched on some of these regulations, right, at the beginning, and these are, you know, again, obviously, these are all still very much in play. And I would say that regulators, plaintiffs, attorneys, everyone is, you know, extremely, these are all very active, you know, being actively pursued, right? And so this is, you know, it's nobody's getting a free pass with respect to privacy and security. And so I think that, you know, again, keeping your eye on, or having outside counsel or advisors, right, who are really keeping their eyes on what's going on, and giving you the information you need and helping you kind of stay up to date, because frankly, things are changing, you know, quite a bit. And so if you're, and don't hesitate to go back if you made a policy even 6 months ago and redo it, right? And keep it up to speed and do continuous training and continuous refreshes, right, of what the landscape is, I think is just really, really important. The one thing I think quickly we just want to touch on, health declarations. So these are, and you know, you see these everywhere, right? You see these in the work, or in the workplace as you're having people come back into work. You're also seeing this as people are going back out into stores and different, right? So I mean, these are things that are happening everywhere, and you're absolutely allowed to, I mean, you're encouraged, right? The laws are, you know, are encouraging you and changing, frankly, with respect to doing these health declarations. There are obviously issues with respect to the methods that you're using. Are you doing these on apps? Are you doing these on paper? And so how are you keeping the information that you collect? And are you keeping it anonymous? And are you alerting other people or authorities with respect to the information that you receive? Let's say someone tells you that they are COVID positive. So how do you deal with that? And those are all very fact-specific questions that you need to have an expert, you know, weigh in and help you, you know, and help you evaluate sort of all of that, the procedures around that. But these are absolutely, I mean, this is, I would say, mandatory at this point, right, to be having these kinds of health declarations. So again, I just want to be mindful of time. And I think we're moving into, again, so let's see, recommendations and best practices, right? Supplemental notice. You're seeing companies update their privacy statement either with this or online. You know, they'll have a separate statement with respect to these protocols and health declarations. Again, data minimization, which is what I touched on, which is the data that you're collecting is obviously sensitive. So what are you doing with it, right? And then who has eyes on it after the fact? And again, take a look at, you know, it's always the same scenario. The fewest number of eyes is obviously, you know, in order to achieve the purpose that you want to achieve, is the best practice always, right? And so security protocols. I think Natalie is going to take over on thermal screening.
Yeah, quickly, I'll go through thermal screening. So you know, these range from, you know, my husband's a coach, and so he is taking one of those handheld devices and making sure that he's checking his football players' temperatures. So it ranges from that all the way to, you know, kiosks that have thermal imaging and that are taking the temperature of the folks that are entering into buildings. And so there's a wide range of different thermal screening devices and temperature check devices that are being put in place. And I'm sure many of you are doing this at your workplaces as well. There's a list here. Go ahead and go to the next slide here. Okay, so with respect to thermal screening, some recommendations that we have. You know, you'll want to make sure that you're offering a private or semi-private area for screening. You know, this sometimes isn't possible, but you know, you want to at least give the option of allowing the individual to have a private screening or a semi-private screening. But the key here is to be consistent in your approach. Don't treat anyone differently. Make sure that you're doing it, doing it consistently, and train your employees to make sure that they're doing it correctly and consistently. You'll want to develop and implement a protocol for identifying and responding to screening results. If there is a result that somebody has a high temperature, how are you going to handle that? And so you'll want to make sure that you put those protocols in place. The same issues of supplemental notice, limited data retention, disclosure limitations, and security protocols that Cynthia just went through with respect to the health declarations apply here. So I won't go through those all over again. So, the key here with respect to thermal screening is you obviously want to, and with respect to the health declarations, is you want to make sure that you're providing notice, you're recording no data if possible, or limited data, and you're protecting the information that you do have and that you are getting. So, okay, we can go ahead and move on to the next slide.
So contact tracing, and this is a topic that we could talk about this all day, and there's so many issues related to this. And I think just, the kind of background is that, contact tracing is a very, I would say, old, it's an old school method, right? It's an old school method to prevent transmitting and isolating people who might be transmitting, right, and isolating them from the general population. And in the past, it was done obviously without apps and technology, and that has changed. And but again, in the context, in today's sort of world of mobile apps and Bluetooth technology, there are ostensibly ways to do this, and to through these apps, and to protect people's privacy, but it's confusing and it's difficult, and I think it has not really taken off necessarily in the way that people had hoped. Because of those privacy issues, and so I think companies are struggling, and I see my clients struggling with, how do you roll out an app? Do you do it with a piece of paper? Do you do it the old-fashioned paper way and ask questions and have interviews? And I think that these are some really difficult questions, right? And again, I just would always, with respect to rolling out any sort of contact tracing technologies, make sure that you're getting advice on how to do it, and advice on the different methods, because they are very different, and they're changing pretty regularly. So contact tracing is not obligatory with respect to apps. You can't force people to sign in and out of an app with respect to contact tracing employees. But so you just need to, again, if this is what you're looking at doing, make sure that you're getting the advice of an expert who walks you through all of the plethora of issues around rolling out these technologies in the workplace. And also just, again, making sure with respect to liability and exposure in any apps that you're using. And this I would recommend with any third parties that you're bringing in, you're signing new agreements with new technologies or new security tools. Make sure that you really are properly vetting the negotiation of those terms, right? So that you are protecting your company first and foremost. With respect to liability, and then also in the rollout and implementation. Again, take the time to look at all of these issues very carefully, because they will come back to bite you, if there's a problem. And so, this is, we're in a sort of like rush, and yet at the same time, the same principles always apply, right? Try to take a step back and go carefully and get the advice that you need, because these are extremely sensitive, and I would say could be very expensive issues to litigate.
I think we're running out of time here, so maybe go through these quick. Yeah.
So okay. So anyway, so key considerations. Again, I mean, I think really Natalie and I touched on this, and I guess the one thing that I just would really highlight is, people are under a lot of stress, and I know that sounds obvious, but it's true, and you need to keep that in mind. And Natalie touched on layoffs or different issues, and I think that people under extremely stressful situations will not necessarily act in rational or reasonable ways that you would have expected, right? And so keep that in mind as you're rolling out new practices, as you're thinking about, no, but no one ever behaved like this in the past. Well, this is a different environment, right? And so people will be pushed to act in ways. I have seen some extremely strange behavior, right, from employees of clients that they wouldn't have expected. And so again, I just think, ultimately having the framework, keeping those things in mind, but also just having it always top of mind that we're in a very different environment, right? So that's kind of my 2 cents. Natalie, do you want to add?
Nope, that's great. I will just say, if anyone we went through all of this very quickly, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we will address those for you. So, Cynthia, I guess we're turning it over to Mike now.
Yeah, so I'm frankly thrilled to participate, or not participate, but listen to our next presentation, which is a panel discussion. And I will let Mike take over, but it's a great lineup of panelists. And so Mike Tarosian, who is a partner in San Francisco, so he and I work very closely and see each other all the time, at least when we were allowed to. So take it away.